Okay, so it's a couple of minutes, 3 minutes past 6, so I guess we could make a start. Just say a little prayer. Our loving parent, we thank you so much that we can have this opportunity to meet together through Zoom to be able to study and your providence, the way that you've been working through history, through the different nations of the world to try to create a foundation to receive the Messiah. Father, when we look, you can see many times it's been a very painful history. Sometimes there have been successes, sometimes there have been failures, sometimes things have gone forward, sometimes things have gone backwards. And it's been very, very complicated and very, very, we pray, Father, for all those people who made your providence go forward, sometimes at the cost of their own life. We can really appreciate the foundation upon which we stand and how blessed and how lucky we are to have the freedom to be able to worship you, to be able to speak and talk and do many of the things that most people in human history never were able to do. And I ask you to be present with us this evening. I ask this in my name. Amen. Okay, so good evening. There's you just popped in. Hi, Mary. And I'll just share my screen with you. Hi, Terry. Okay, so Monday and Tuesday then we were looking at God's providence to the Slavs, the way that it developed there, and Slavic lands, and we got as far as Peter the Great. And we could see, how things went in a good way, but also how there are many, many setbacks, which created the conditions which enabled communists to seize power many, many hundreds of years later. So I want to come back now to look at the providence in Western Europe, which is where it developed more successfully, try and understand why. So first of all, we had the decline and the collapse of the Roman Empire, and talked about that a few months ago, January I think it was, or February, and why it was that God's providence moved from the Roman Empire to the Germanic tribes, because the Roman Empire had become totalitarian. The state took over every aspect of people's lives, and also with Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, there's no longer a foundation to receive the Messiah, because there's no longer any religious freedom. So had the Messiah been born in the Roman Empire, and had he not subscribed to the Nicene Creed, then he would have been accused of being a heretic and would have either been driven out of the empire or might even have lost his life. So because of this, God's providence or God's grace or blessing moved and went to the Germanic tribes. You saw how that developed into the Anglo-Saxon world. Now we're going to come back to this and see what happened with Western Europe and the Franks particularly. And so with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, then a Merovingian dynasty appeared, and they became the rulers of the Franks. And they dominated this area, ruled this area, which used to be called Gaul under the Roman period. This was the capital, was Paris, and they ruled for on and off, but gradually it became weaker, and gradually the power moved to the mayor of the palace of Paris. And then one of the most, probably the most well-known mayor of the palace was called Charles Martel. And we also looked at the how the Muslims have moved up. We looked at that, the rise of Islam, how it spread through North Africa. Muslims invaded what was then Spain. Spain at that time was the kingdom of the Visigoths. The Visigoths were predominantly Aryan. They were Goths who sort of migrated all the way from there through here and settled here. And so what's now called Spain then became Muslim. And then a Muslim army then crossed over the Pyrenees and entered into what's now called France. So Charles Martel, who was the mayor of the palace, he gathered an army together and he defeated the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours in 732. And then after that, the Muslim armies retreated back across the Pyrenees. And at the same time, he established feudalism in this area here. This here is the dynasty, this here is the area ruled by the Merovingians. This kind of area here. You might have come across the Merovingians recently, well, not that film, what was it called? The Matrix. You know, I don't know if you remember the Matrix. There's one of the characters in the Matrix was called the Merovingian. Anyway, so these were largely pagan people here, and then St. Boniface from Devon, which is over here, he came over to the continent, and he then became the apostle to the Germans. The Saxons were all pagans, so he came from England. So the English came from Germany, the Anglo-Saxons, they became Christianized, and then they sent missionaries back to Germany. And so Boniface, who came from Devon, he became the main missionary to Germany and called the apostle to the Germans. And also he reformed the Frankish church under Charles Martel. And also he encouraged Charles Martel and the Carolingians, as what became the Carolingians, the family of Charles Martel, to form a relationship with the papacy, with the Pope. And Charles Martel then was the grandfather of Charlemagne. So one of Charles Martel's sons, called Pepin, he became the king of the Franks. So the Merovingian dynasty stopped in 751. One of Charles Martel's sons, Pepin, he was appointed and crowned king of the Franks by the Pope Stephen. And then Pepin, who was the son of Charles Martel, became the father of Charlemagne. So, have a look at Charlemagne. He was, as I said, became the king of the Franks, and then he expanded Carolingian rule. During his rule, he was constantly at war. He made some incursions into Spain, crossing the Pyrenees, fighting against Muslims. He also was at war with the Saxons for 30 years, had about 18 or 19 battles with the Saxons, trying to force them to become Christian. Also fought against the Frisians and the Slavs and the Avars, and went quite far to the east. So he was constantly at war, and at the same time he was a Christian, but he was forcing people to become Christians at the point of the sword. Particularly the Saxons, who were pagans, and they didn't want to convert to Christianity. So he was at war with them again and again and again, and he wanted the Saxons to conform to and follow Frankish laws. But the Saxons were very precious about their own laws, their own legal system, which is customary, which we looked at before, a source of common law in England, and so they refused to accept Charlemagne's authority to impose his laws upon them, but also to impose Christianity upon them. And so he passed the law saying that any Saxon refused to convert would be put to death. There was continual fighting over the Saxon land. And then at one point, there was a massacre of Verdun in 782, where he defeated the Saxons and took 4,500 prisoners. They refused to convert to Christianity, so they had them all beheaded. So that's how Christianity was spread in Western Europe, by Charlemagne using the sword. So people often say, well, that's what Muslims did, but actually I think one needs to look a little bit closer to home. Anyway, at the same time, Charlemagne did some good things. There was what's often called the Carolingian Renaissance. He invited someone called Saint Alcuin of York. So he was like Boniface was the apostle to the Germans, and Alcuin from York, which is in northern England, an incredibly learned man. He came to Charlemagne's court, and he was involved in this spiritual, educational, cultural renaissance, which Charlemagne sponsored of the arts. And also Charlemagne sponsored a lot of political and church reforms. But although we talk about a Carolingian Renaissance, we need to remember at the same time what was going on in Islamic Spain at this time was far more advanced than anything that was taking place in Western Europe under the Carolingian Renaissance. Muslim Spain was far more advanced in terms of education, art, culture, architecture, in every single sphere. It's far more advanced than Europe at that time. He's also called the father of Europe, and so there's a lot of hankering amongst Europeans who tried to recreate the Charlemagne's empire. So this is the extent of his empire here. This is a Frankish territory originally, and then gradually he expanded it and conquered all these different areas here. So expanded, invaded these areas here, the Moravian, Navarre, even got as far into Thuringia and all these areas here, and down into Lombardy, or what's now known as Italy. So that was Charlemagne's empire. So in 799, then the Pope Leo III, he got into, anyway, Rome was, there was a lot of powerful families in Rome, and the Pope, although he lived in Rome in the Vatican, he wasn't the ruler of Rome, and he often got into conflicts with some of the families that were there, and so he annoyed them, and so in 799, he was mistreated by the Romans. They roughed him up, some Romans roughed him up, they tried to put his eyes out and blind him, and so he fled from Rome. He escaped to, I can't remember the name of the town, where Charlemagne was. And when he fled to Charlemagne as the king of the Franks and pleaded his case to Charlemagne. So the Pope then, you realize that even though he's the spiritual head of the Catholic Church, you realize he was politically, militarily very weak. He needed a protector. And so he spoke to Leo III. So he spoke to Charlemagne. And then Alcuin, Charlemagne consulted Alcuin. Alcuin advised Charlemagne to go to Rome and to sort things out and to offer his support to the Pope. And so Charlemagne traveled down to Rome, and he initiated a synod, which is like a council. And in the synod, then the Pope pleaded his innocence, and Charlemagne then supported him, and the Pope's position as Pope was restored in Rome. But then this became like a major issue. So this is someone called Catholic historian. That by whom, however, could he, the Pope, be tried? So the Pope then saw themselves as being appointed by God, the Apostle of Christ, who, in other words, is qualified to pass judgment on the Vicar of Christ. In normal circumstances, the only conceivable answer to that question would have been the Emperor at Constantinople. But the imperial throne at this moment was occupied by Irene. By the old Salic tradition, which is in Western Europe under the Merovingians, a woman was debarred from being the ruler. So as far as Western Europe was concerned, the throne of the emperors was vacant. So this became an issue then. Irene herself, she was the empress, and she had a son, Constantine IV, I think it was, who had become the emperor. But she got into conflict with Constantine, so she deposed her own son, and then she started to rule in his place. So she then was the empress. But from the point of view of Western Europe, she wasn't regarded as being legitimate in that sense, because it wasn't legitimate for a woman to rule and to be on the throne. And so normally it would be only the person who could sit in judgment upon the Pope would be the emperor, but there was nobody who's regarded as being a legitimate emperor. And the papacy then had been in quite a lot of doctrinal conflict with Constantinople as well, with Irene over the issue of icons, whether icons are legitimate or not legitimate. So this then became an issue. Who was able to sit in judgment? And so that's when Charlemagne called the synod. Then Charlemagne then was, in that sense, sitting in judgment upon the Pope and declaring that the Pope was innocent. So this then became a controversy. And then, a few days later, on Christmas Eve, I think, or Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, I think it was, then Charlemagne went to pray in Rome, where he still was, a few days after the synod. And then the Pope came out with a crown and crowned him to be the Emperor of the Romans. So this then was politically incredibly controversial. So, following the abdication of the last emperor, that was Constantine, there was just one empire ruled from Constantinople. Sorry, the last Western emperor. Oh, I can't remember his name now. Anyway, the last Western emperor who had abdicated. That meant there was just one empire ruled from Constantinople. So Constantine himself had divided the empire into two. There's a Western emperor in Rome and an Eastern emperor in Constantinople. But when the last Western emperor abdicated, that meant there's no longer a Western emperor, which meant the empire itself was now reunited with just one empire ruled from Constantinople. But then, as I said, the Pope and people, Western Europeans, they couldn't, or the leaders anyway, rejected the legitimacy of Empress Irene at Constantinople. And so by the Pope crowning Charlemagne to become the Emperor of the Romans, he was declaring that Charlemagne then was the heir to the deposed Constantine VI. So Irene had deposed her son, Constantine VI, and so what the Pope was doing by crowning Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans, he was effectively making Charlemagne the Emperor of all of the Roman Empire, not just the West, but the East as well. And obviously this didn't go down very well in Constantinople. And so naturally this led to war between the West and conflict over the legitimacy over the emperor in Rome, over Charlemagne's title, and over and Constantinople. So Charlemagne himself very, very rarely ever used that title, Emperor of the Romans, because it just caused endless amounts of problems. So there's a lot of debate and discussion whether Charlemagne really wanted this to happen. It didn't help Charlemagne's position to become the Emperor of the Romans. And so it's often thought that it was like a trick played by the Pope, crowning Charlemagne to become the Emperor of the Romans. And the Pope did it for his own purposes, and Charlemagne himself didn't really want this to happen. Charlemagne himself wanted to try and resolve things rather more peacefully. So he sent some ambassadors to Constantinople with a marriage proposal to Irene. Irene herself was quite sympathetic to the idea of marrying Charlemagne, but the other people, powerful figures in Constantinople, didn't like this idea because they obviously didn't want to have Charlemagne ruling Constantinople. So Irene herself then was pushed aside. So Charlemagne then himself, he crowned his son Louis the Pious. So he crowned his son himself. He didn't let the Pope crown his son. And then he died in Aachen in 814, and Louis became the next ruler and king of the Franks, and he divided the empire amongst his three sons, which led to several civil wars. So the question is then, what authority does the Pope have to crown Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans? If I were to come along, and I can see Len sitting on my little screen here, if I were to come along and visit Len and bring a crown and say to Len, Len, I am going to crown you King of England, would anybody pay any attention to that? No. Why not? Because they would say William Haines does not have the authority to appoint and crown Len Cotter King of England. It would be a meaningless thing. Yeah, it would be meaningless. It would have no significance, be no authority there. Would not have any legitimacy. So the question is, well, why does this act of the Pope, why is it regarded as being legitimate? So as John Julius Norwich says, by bestowing the imperial crown upon Charlemagne, the Pope abrogated to himself the right to appoint the Emperor of the Romans, establishing the imperial crown as his personal gift, but simultaneously granting himself implicit superiority over the emperor whom he created. So this is why Charlemagne wasn't happy, well anyway, people often say he wasn't happy to be crowned by the Pope, because if the Pope can crown Charlemagne, it means the Pope has the authority to decide who becomes the emperor, And if you have the authority to appoint an emperor or a king, you have the authority to depose or get rid of an emperor or a king. And no king wanted to have a pope who to have their title coming from that. And so where did this come from then? So there's a document called the Donation of Constantine. So it's thought to have been forged in the middle of the 8th century. And this document was supposedly left by Constantine when Constantine set up the Constantinople and the empire in the east. He's supposed to have written, or one of his descendants supposed to have written a letter to the Pope, granting the Pope authority in Rome and the authority to appoint an emperor in the West. But this is supposed to have been, for a long time, this became the source of authority for papal power in Europe, right up until the Middle Ages, when it was exposed to be late Middle Ages and exposed to be a forgery, probably written in the middle of the 8th century. So why was it forged? Well, at this time, Pope Stephen II, he was negotiating with Pepin. So as I said, Pope needed to have somebody to protect him from the Romans and from other people. He didn't have his own armies at that time, or much of his own land. And so the Pope then was negotiating with Pepin, and Pepin, who was the son of Charles Martel, he wanted to become the king of the Franks. But who, because the last Merovingian king had died. So who then could possibly have the authority to make Pepin the king of the Franks, so that Pepin could be the king with some legitimacy? And so the Pope said, well, actually, I have the authority to appoint and to crown you the legitimate king of the Franks. And the reason I have this authority is because the emperor gave me this authority. So an emperor can appoint a king. So the emperor gave me the authority to appoint a king. And so Stephen II, he crowned Pepin, and in that way he also ended the Merovingian line. So that set up a new dynasty over the Franks. And then in exchange, Pepin gave land in Italy to the Pope. So the Pope didn't have much land. So Pepin gave land to Italy. These became the Papal States, and this was the source of Vatican power and wealth for the next 1,000 years, basically, up until the Concordat signed with Hitler. So that's what happened there. Was it forged? So that's the question. It seems that it was forged, but Catholic in defense would say, well, it wasn't forged. There was such a document, but it was lost. That document existed, but for some reason, as it got destroyed, or it had decayed because it was hundreds of years old, or it had been burned in a fire, or something, or got lost. So what was happening? Pope Stephen II wasn't forging it. It was just being recreated based upon memory, that kind of thing. So that's a sort of controversial thing. But anyway, the point is that this led to church-state. This defined church-state relations in Western Europe for the next 1,000 years. And even up until today, there's a lot of conflict in church and the state. Who is the ultimate source of authority? The state or the church? Who can decide what the law is? The church or the state? And so we can see echoes of this going on. Does the state have the authority to stand in judgment over the church? Do civil courts have the authority to stand in judgment on priests, particularly in Catholic countries? So a huge controversy for hundreds of years, even until the last century, even till today. You look at somewhere like Ireland, there was a lot of controversy there. Priests who committed some kind of illegal criminal act would be sheltered and protected by the church, and the state would say they should be tried by the church courts and not by the state, not by the civil court. So this problem plagued Europe for the next 1,000 years. So what should the relationship be like? Well, This is what it says in the principle, where it talks about, has a little commentary upon Pope crowned Charlemagne. Commentary is this: after crowning and blessing the emperor, the Pope was to obey him as one of his subjects in temporal matters. The emperor in turn was to lift up and further the spiritual work of the papacy in his realm. So we can see that the emperor certainly was trying to further the spiritual work of the papacy. I don't think that was necessarily a good thing, because it meant that the power of the state was used to persecute heretics. Then the Pope didn't obey the emperor or the king as one in temporal matters, because the Pope thought that he had absolute authority, as we'll come on to see. So this is, according to the principle, this is how the relation should have been, that kind of relationship, each having their own sphere of activity. Pope had to acknowledge the emperor in temporal matters, which was in civil law, for example. A priest who committed murder should be tried in the king's court, and if found guilty, given the same punishment as any other subject, where the emperor also should be guided by the church in spiritual activity. Okay, so what happened next? Well, much of European history is defined by what's going on in the east. We talked about that before, with the tribes moving in from the east and how that led to the Huns moving into Rome. Anyway, now there are the Magyar tribes moving in from the east, and they were threatening the eastern section of the Carolingian Empire. And the Carolingians then, they were based in what we now call the French part, the French side. And so someone called Conrad I of Germany, he was the first non-Carolingian, and he was he was elected to be the king of Germany. And he was elected by the German nobles. And then after he died, then he supported someone called Henry Fowler to become the next king of the Germans. So he was a German, and he was elected in 919 by the nobles and crowned as the first non-Frankish king. So Conrad I, he was Frankish on the western side of Europe. Henry Fowler, though, he was from the Germanic tribes, and he was elected by the nobles and became the first non-Frankish king in 919. And interestingly enough, he refused to be anointed or crowned by the archbishop, because he didn't want his authority to come from the church. And he wanted his authority to come from the nobles. So this is the ancient Germanic tribal tradition. The way in which a king is anointed is by acclamation. So everyone would acclaim, "God save the king," and this is the way that the king will be recognized. So he refused to be anointed by the archbishop. And then he was the founder of the Ottonian dynasty. So this is the beginning of a new dynasty within Europe, and the separation of Germany and France, well, later became Germany and France. He's the founder of the medieval German state. So unlike the Carolingians and the Carolingian tradition, which continues in France, Henry didn't seek to establish a centralized monarchy. Instead, he wanted to rule through federated autonomous stem duchies. And so that's basically the same tradition that continues to exist in Germany until today. It's you have a federal state, you have the Länder, and everything's quite decentralized. So if you look at what's going on at the moment, Merkel may be the chancellor, but she doesn't have absolute authority in Germany in the way that Macron does in France, or to a lesser extent, Boris Johnson does in England. He doesn't have it in Scotland or Wales. So anyway, for the last 1,000 years, that was a pattern. And even before then, when we looked at the Germanic tribes, we could see democracy is deeply rooted in the Germanic political culture and Germanic system. And this continued here. So Henry Fowler, he reinvigorated the tradition of the Germanic tribes that a king should be elected, not and for things to be decentralized. Then when he died, he was succeeded by his son, Otto the Great. He became king in 936. And then he, for some reason, I can't remember now, 962, he was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. And so one of the things he did was end the Hungarian invasion. So the Magyars, they were moving in from the east. That was one of the reasons for the necessity of having their own king, because they were trying to rely upon the Carolingians. Carolingians weren't really interested in defending the Germanic tribes, the Germanic part of the empire. And so that's why Henry Fowler was elected and appointed, and he led fighting against the Magyars. And Otto the Great, then he ended these Hungarian invasions, and the Hungarians just settled and stayed in Hungary. That's Otto the Great. So in the west, then, the Carolingians themselves were declining, and someone called King Louis V, he was the last of the Carolingian rulers, and then he was replaced or succeeded by someone called Hugh Capet. I don't know much about this history. He's from the family of the Robert. They were all kind of intermarried anyway, and very interconnected with each other. Anyway, so he was elected and crowned in 987. So again, you had a new dynasty in the west. And again, this house lasted for several centuries. The founder and the first king in the House of Capet ruling over what is now modern France. So you have this division then between the east and the west. Became much more substantial. And he made Paris the center of his power. So you've got a division to what we call the West Franks, the East Franks. Really, these were the Germans anyway. Germanic tribes, which had only become part of the Carolingian Empire because Charlemagne had invaded and dominated them. So that was that separation. But then also at this time you had what we call a Great Schism within the church itself. So all this orange area here, this is all part of the Roman Catholic Church, ruled from Rome. And there's one universal Catholic Church, transcending nationality, transcending nations. And there was an emperor, and he was over many of these kings who ruled different parts of this area. And then in the east, you had the Orthodox churches. As I explained before, they were national churches. They had the Russian Orthodox Church, this area here, I think this one here would be the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, you have the Greek Orthodox Church, this whole area here, Greece and Constantinople was here, and different Orthodox churches. They were national churches. And there were these 5 patriarchates. So gradually they started to separate. Basically, first of all, the Roman Catholic Church, the common language here was Latin. So all the prelates, the bishops, the cardinals, they all spoke Latin to each other. So they had a common unifying language as well as the vernacular. In the East, the common vernacular unifying language was Greek. So as with the decline of the empire, decline of learning, fewer and fewer people were able to speak Greek and Latin. So it became harder and harder for Catholics and the Orthodox to be able to communicate with each other. And so along with this came a difference of belief. So I mentioned this again before, this filioque clause. I think it was in Spain when they were fighting against some heretic there. They decided to add this "and the Son" clause to the Nicene Creed. And then this tradition of saying the Nicene Creed, I believe the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. This tradition then started to spread, and this tradition eventually reached Rome. The Pope himself, who was ruling in Rome at the time, said that is not correct. That is incorrect. And so the Pope, to try to correct everybody, because everyone was starting saying "and the Son," and the Pope got a brass plaque and he screwed it on to the wall in St. Peter's Basilica, so that everybody could see this is what the Nicene Creed is, and it doesn't include the Filioque clause. But anyway, people just carried on saying it, and it just became what people thought was right. Anyway, in the East, they said, actually, you've changed the Nicene Creed. And the Catholic Church said, no, we haven't changed it, you've changed it. You forgot to add "and the Son." Somehow, when you're copying it out and transcribing it, one of your copiers left out Filioque. You're the one that changed it, not us. So that was a level of sort of ignorance, you might say, things that degenerated to. Both thought that they were right, and so they excommunicated each other. And the funny thing is that when they excommunicated each other in when was it, 1054, they sent these letters of excommunication, but because one side wrote in Latin, the other side wrote in Greek, when these letters of excommunication arrived, they couldn't understand that they'd been excommunicated because they couldn't translate these letters of excommunication until a long time later. Anyway, there's also disagreement about the authority of the Pope. So there were 5 patriarchates in Rome, in Constantinople, and Antioch, in Alexandria, and Jerusalem. So in the early days, they were all regarded as being equal, but the Pope was regarded as being the first among equals. The reason for this in Rome, because the apostle that founded Rome was Peter. Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. And so in terms of precedence and prestige, amongst the 5 patriarchates, Rome was always first. But the other patriarchates always regarded Rome as being just the first among equals. All the patriarchs are equal because they all had this ancient foundation. Just the Pope is like more, the papacy is the more prestigious of them, that's all. Anyway, but in Rome, though, the Pope thought that he was a supreme head over all the churches. And so again, that became, not just over the Catholic Church, but he saw himself as the supreme head of all the Orthodox churches as well. So of course, this didn't go down very well. So, as I said, in 1054, they split. And there wasn't a reconciliation, as far as I know, really, until the mid-1960s, when I think it was when Pope John went and visited the Patriarch of Constantinople. This is one of the great tragedies. When you get this kind of division, it's almost impossible to have reconciliation and healing. It's almost impossible for people to recognize that maybe they got it wrong, and to admit that they got it wrong, and to apologize and repent and to try to make it up. And even till today, there's a huge amount of conflict between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Not so much the one in Constantinople, which is quite weak, but now particularly with the Russian Orthodox Church. Quite a lot of conflict there between the Catholic Church and Russian Orthodox Church. And okay, another really important event that took place, and again, this is connected to church-state relations. It was called the Investiture Controversy, and this is something that bedeviled Europe for much of the Middle Ages. So investiture is giving the symbols of power and office to a person. So when you invest somebody, it means that you give them a letter or a crown or a staff or whatever it is that invests into the authority of a particular role or position. So the question is then, well, who has the authority to appoint church officials? Who has the authority to appoint priests? Who has the authority to appoint bishops? Who has the authority to appoint archbishops, etc., etc.? And so with the decline of the Roman Empire, then for a long period of time, in many places, the secular authorities, they were the ones who would appoint bishops, that kind of authority, or Local secular authorities might decide to appoint a priest, and particularly the emperor chose and appointed the pope, and in return the pope would appoint the emperor. And you might wonder, why was that the case? Well, the church is a major landowner. Often when people died, in order to gain some favor with God and the next world, often they would leave land to the church. They would often, in their will, they'd bequeath vast tracts of land to the church. Kings would do this, dukes, earls, and so the church then became an incredible landowner. I think at one point it owned about a quarter or a third of the land in Europe was owned by the church. The thing about the church is the church never dies. So once land is given to the church, it never is transferred or given away by the church. It stays with the church. So the church then will just be accumulating and accumulating land over the decades and over the centuries until it became an incredibly large landowner. But in those days, land was a source of power. This meant that the church then, as a major landowner, was incredibly powerful. Because under feudalism, there were peasants who were living on the land, and the landowner, the feudal lord, would be the one who could decide who the peasants would fight for. So if you're the king and you wanted to raise an army, you had to get peasants to come and join your army. If you wanted to get peasants, then it means you had to persuade the feudal lord to send some of his peasants to join your army. So from the point of view of the king and the secular authorities, it was really important who is the bishop or who is the priest. They wanted to have their friends, and they wanted to have church leaders who were also going to be political allies. Because if the church leaders and bishops weren't political allies of the king, then the king's position was very, very weak. He couldn't go and do the sort of things that he wanted to do. And so you might think, well, that's really odd, how couldn't that happen? Well, I'm telling you, even till today, in England, the Queen, she's the head of state, but also she's the head of the Church of England. And you might wonder, well, who appoints the Archbishop? Well, it used to be the Queen or the King appointing the Archbishop. But then it became the Prime Minister would appoint the Archbishop because he was the Queen's first minister. And so the authority to appoint the Archbishop was devolved to the Prime Minister. And that went on for a long time. And then it wasn't until the 20th century that the church decided, well, we'd like to appoint the Archbishop ourselves. And so there were negotiations. And of course, the Prime Minister wanted to appoint the Archbishop because it's nice to have an Archbishop who's on your side, politically, member of your party, adopting and supporting your political policies. And that's the way it works. Anyway, so it wasn't until, I think, the mid-1970s when the compromise was reached and a little independent body was established that would recommend two candidates to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister would be able to choose one of these two. Anyway, so all the people in this independent body, they knew who they wanted, and so they put this person forward, but they had to recommend two, and so they recommended another person who they didn't think very highly of. And so according to the legend, when these two names were presented to Mrs. Thatcher, she didn't like the one who they liked, and so she appointed the other one because she thought he might be more favorable to me because she suspected that maybe his political policies are more conservative than the other one. And that's the way it goes. So that's the way it works. Anyway, so the church, though, is not happy about that. And so even till today, Westminster Abbey, for example, is called a royal peculiar. So the Queen herself personally appoints the person who's going to be in charge of Westminster Abbey. It's a personal appointment by the Queen. So you can see these sort of things go on for centuries. Anyway, so that's what's going on there. Anyway, so at the same time, um, if you're a priest or a bishop, you're incredibly wealthy. So if you're a priest, you would own the church over which you're the priest would be a huge landowner. And all the members of your congregation, as good Christians, they had to tithe 1/10 of everything they had. And so in every village, there was what's called a tithe barn, which is a huge barn in which the tithes were collected. 1/10 of everything was contributed. And the priest then would be the one who would pass on 1/10 of that onto the bishop, and then the rest of it he would administer together with the parish council. And if there are times of famine or difficulty, if somebody is a widow, then they would redistribute, this wealth of the tithe to support and look after the poor and the needy within the parish. But at the same time, because the priest had a lot of authority there, then the family of the priest would be doing pretty well. That's why often you find the priest would live in a bigger house than anybody else. And then bishops also had a huge income stream. That's why bishops would live in a palace and would live in incredible wealth. And so these bishops then, they wouldn't just be religious leaders, they'd also be political leaders as well. There'd be nobles, there'd be feudal lords as well. So there's a huge fusion here of political, secular, and religious power and authority. And so if you wanted to become a bishop, then so the king then, having the authority to appoint bishops, he would say, okay, you want to become a bishop, well, I'll sell you the bishopric. And so selling bishoprics then became a source of money for the king. So the king could decide who's going to become the bishop. If you wanted to become the bishop, you could give the king, transfer a large amount of money into the king's bank account. Then he would appoint you to become the bishop. And then you'd have authority and control over this great income stream coming in. And then, of course, that was called simony, called a simony. And same with becoming a priest and all these kind of positions. So a lot of Christians in the church, they weren't very, very happy with this kind of thing. And they felt this was kind of awkward. And you might wonder, as a priest, what do you want? Well, in those days, monks were not married and nuns were not married. They lived in monasteries or convents. But ordinary priests were married. Still in the Orthodox churches, priests are married. Only monks and nuns are not married. But in the Catholic Church, up until about the 12th century, priests were also married. But then if you're a priest and you're married and you have kids, what do you want? You want one of your kids to become the next priest, because you want your kids to do well. And so what would happen then is that a particular family would essentially capture a particular parish, and the parishes then be passed on from generation to generation through these sort of families. And then, anyway, it was kind of corrupt. And so one of the ways of trying to solve this problem, I'll come on to the investiture part later after the break. One of the ways of trying to solve this problem was to declare, I think it was one of the Lateran, one of the councils, they declared that priests were not allowed to marry, in order that when a priest died, then the bishop could then decide who was going to be the new priest in a particular area. And then, of course, along with that, they came up with a theological explanation, theological justification, that Christ wasn't married, and the priest was married to the church, etc., etc., etc. But, the realistic, practical reason was to try to eliminate corruption within the church, trying to eliminate nepotism. And, of course, that's always a challenge within a spiritual, religious community. Yeah, nepotism. Why does somebody get a particular position of authority? Is it because they're related to somebody who has authority? Are you appointing your own sons, daughters, nephews, cousins, uncles to a particular position because you know they're going to be your supporters, they're going to be your allies, you know they're going to be on your side? Or do you appoint someone who's actually the most qualified for that particular position. So this again is a great temptation, in terms of church government and any kind of government. Yeah, so I said this was a huge thing, church-state relations, and who has the authority to do all these things? Obviously, this is a problem of corruption, ultimately. So within the church, then, there are lots of debates and discussions about this. And then you have something called, and so a lot of people, members of the church, then, they wanted to reclaim the power of investiture. And so there's one thing, sometimes things are written in the rules, the laws, the canon laws, but sometimes in practice it doesn't work out like that because the king says, well, I don't mind what the rules say, this is what I've always done, this is what my ancestors did, that's what I'm going to do. And so it's kind of, as I said, these sorts of things even happen today. So I can't remember exactly what, but certainly within the last few years, as I said, there was this situation in England, the Church of England, and the Queen has the power of patronage over certain kind of the appointment of certain kind of people within the church. But then it came out that when you actually look at the fine print, when you actually read the rules, it says that the chapter, I think it's Westminster Abbey, it says the chapter has to elect who's going to be the head of the church. And then there was some discussion amongst some of the clergy, well, maybe we should actually follow the rules. Maybe, instead of just automatically agreeing to elect the person who we've been told to elect by the Queen's representative, maybe we'll have a proper election and decide to elect somebody else. But anyway, it didn't happen, of course. So but that was the discussion then. Now trying to reclaim the power of patronage, power of investiture. And I said, basically, for secular authorities, it's really important to decide who's going to be the bishop and the priest, because it's only through that you can exercise power within your own nation, your own country. And so they decided, try to work out how to do that. Anyway, and so in 1056, previous Holy Roman Emperor died, and then Henry IV became the king, but he's only 6 years old at the time. So obviously, as a 6-year-old, he wasn't able to really know what was going on. But he was the only one who had the authority to appoint the Pope. So the church elders got really excited about this. And so 3 years later, they decided, they had a church council, and the church council, not presided over by the emperor, of course, he was only 6 years old, the church council decided to establish a college of cardinals. And it was the college of cardinals that would elect a pope. And so right up until today, when a pope dies, the college of cardinals gather from all over the world, and they meet in whichever building it is in Rome, and they talk about it, and eventually they come to some kind of consensus, and they elect someone who they think will be the most suitable person to be the pope. So again, this sort of idea of democracy is deeply ingrained there. So they, and so when the next pope died, then they elected a new pope. And this is Gregory VII, often called Hildebrandt. And so he came up with what's called the Gregorian Reform. So he declared, as the basis of this theological statement, the church is founded by God. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. And so because the church is founded by God and the Pope is the vicar of Christ, therefore papal authority is the sole universal power. Kings may have power and authority, but above them is the authority and the universal power of the Pope. And so Gregory declared the Pope could depose and appoint an emperor. Already knew he could appoint the emperor, but now he decided the Pope could depose an emperor as well. And then very controversially, he declared that only the Pope could appoint bishops. And then Henry IV, who had by this stage grown up and become an adult, and he wanted to exert his authority as the king, then he went around and appointed a bishop. And then Gregory VII overruled him. He was overruled by the Pope. And then Henry was was really offended by this. And he wrote to the Pope and he said, Henry, king not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand, at present not Pope, but a false monk. So the king, the emperor then wrote to the Pope and said, you're not the Pope, you're a false monk. And he called for the Pope to be deposed and for the election of a new Pope. So you can imagine that was kind of, rather controversial. And so what did the Pope say? Or what did the Pope do? So the Pope's papacy, as we say in Star Wars, the papacy struck back and Gregory excommunicated Henry. And he said, and if you're excommunicated, it means that when you die, you can't go to heaven. You'll go to hell. And the Pope then has the authority as the vicar of Christ to decide whether someone can go to heaven or to hell. So he excommunicated Henry, which means he expelled Henry from the church. And as Augustine said, there's no salvation outside the church. So if you've been excommunicated and you're outside the church, you cannot be saved. You cannot go to heaven when you die. Not only did he excommunicate Henry, he also deposed him as king and said actually he's no longer the king or the emperor. And then furthermore, he released all Christians from the oath of allegiance to Henry. So when a person becomes a king or the emperor, then all the king or emperor's subjects, they all take an oath of allegiance and loyalty to the king. And of course, you're held to that oath of allegiance and loyalty. And if you break it, you're acting disloyally. Yeah, that's an act of betrayal. So Gregory then, he said to all Christians living in Henry's realm, you're released from your oath of allegiance. In other words, you don't have to obey the king. You don't have to obey the emperor. You can and you're no longer being disloyal. And so the German princes, they were getting a bit annoyed with Henry themselves because, as I said, Henry Fowler wanted to have a very decentralized system of government. But Otto, when he became the emperor, decided to gradually started to centralize power. And so under Henry, things were becoming more centralized. Henry's, exerting more power over the princes, moving them around. And so the German princes then, they were quite pleased with the Pope. And so the German princes then, they started to rebel against Henry because they wanted to have more autonomy and more independence within the empire. And then this made Henry's position unsustainable, because if he didn't have the support of the princes, then how could he act as the emperor? The whole Germany was becoming destabilized and unstable. And so he realized he needed to sort out his problem, sort this out with the Pope. So the following year, he went to visit the Pope at Christmas time, and the Pope was staying in Canossa, in some palace there. So Henry went to ask the Pope for forgiveness and to restore his position as being the king and to unexcommunicate him, etc. So the Pope was wondering, how sincere is Henry? Is Henry really sincere, or is he insincere? Is he just coming to apologize and repent because he wants to get his position back, or is he genuinely sorry? And so the Pope decided to make Henry do some penance. And so Henry had to stand in the snow, barefoot in the snow for 3 days until the Pope would grant him an audience. And then Henry went in, saw the Pope, apologized. The Pope welcomed him back into the communion, restored his authority as the emperor. Then he went back to Germany. But then the princes they weren't happy about this. And they didn't want to have Henry back. So the princes then, they decided to elect a rival king for Henry. And then Gregory decided to support his rival king to Henry. And then he excommunicated Henry again. And then Henry at this stage is getting rather tired of this. So he attacked Rome and the Vatican, laid siege to Rome, laid siege and the Vatican, invaded the Vatican, and he deposed Gregory and he enthroned Clement, a friend of his, to be the new pope. Within the Catholic tradition, Clement called the anti-pope. And then Gregory wanted some help, so he invited the Normans. The Normans were very powerful at that time in Sicily and various other parts of the Italian peninsula. So they were looking for a way to get power as well. So when Gregory invited the Romans to come along and get the Normans to get involved, the Normans were very happy to do that, because it meant that they could start to exert their authority over the papacy. So the Normans entered Rome, they drove Henry out, and they rescued Gregory. But Gregory was a bit sort of traumatized by this whole experience, and he died shortly afterwards. Then the Normans and then a new pope was elected by the cardinals under the influence of the Normans. So the new pope was elected who was sympathetic and supportive of Norman authority. So it's kind of messy in that case. Anyway, during this time, there were also some reform movements. God raised up many people to bring about some reform within the Western Church. And these are some of the outstanding figures, men and women. There was Bernard of Clairvaux, who single-handedly traveled on horseback all over Europe. He founded hundreds and hundreds of monasteries. There's been a huge revival of the whole of Western Christianity. People like St. Hildegard, who I'll mention again in a moment. St. Francis of Assisi, who again is very famous, who was a soldier and had this calling from God to rebuild his church, and got into trouble with his parents as a result because they were wealthy, and started his own order. And St. Dominic started a teaching order to try to improve education within the church. William of Ockham, who was a philosopher, and Julian of Norwich, who was a mystic, and Thomas Aquinas, who was the greatest of the medieval philosophers and theologians. So these are outstanding figures, and many, many more outstanding figures at other times in medieval Europe. And and the interesting thing was, when you look at all these different figures, many of them founded their own orders. So they all pledged loyalty to the Pope. So even though St. Francis of Assisi, he wanted to reform, took this vow of poverty, yet, he pledged loyalty to the Pope, and so his order was acknowledged and accepted, and other ones were too. And of course, even though the Franciscans took a vow of poverty, very soon, within a very short time, people started giving them land, giving them houses, and they, within a short time, became a very wealthy order as well. And these are Julian Norwich, she's a mystic. I can't remember the name of the book now that she published. But emphasized quite a lot the feminine dimension aspect of the divine, which is very interesting. William of Ockham was a nominalist and a skeptic. And then Hildegard, come back to, she was actually Hildegard of Bingen, and she was a scientist and founded a convent, and also an extraordinary musician. And so she's regarded as the founder of German science. She's a woman, but regarded as the founder of German science. She did a huge amount of research and wrote lots of books, and wrote lots of music, and some of the extraordinary things. So it's a little excerpt from some of her music. Those of you who have a Catholic upbringing might remember these kind of but you can see there, in the Middle Ages in the Catholic Church, there was space for some extraordinarily accomplished women to do many different things. And so very often, even though you could say it was very much a male-dominated society, there were convents, and in convents, obviously, are founded by abbesses as an abbess, and some of them incredibly well-educated and incredibly accomplished. And so for women who wanted to do something in that way, they're able to join a convent, receive education, and be able to be involved in all kinds of different areas within society.